Imagine walking through a small colonial village in America nearly 250 years ago. The streets are unpaved, horses pull wooden carts, church bells echo through the morning air, and every family knows every neighbor by name. Yet among these families are surnames that still exist today, names like Smith, Brown, Williams, Johnson, Clark, Taylor, Harris, Carter, and Adams. These names have survived wars, revolutions, migrations, and centuries of change. But where did they come from? Who were the first people to carry these surnames into colonial America? And how did these ordinary family names become part of the history of the United States? Today we're traveling back in time to explore the origins of America's oldest surnames. This is the story of original last names in colonial America. A new world begins long before the United States became an independent nation. The eastern coastline of North America was home to dozens of European colonies. English settlers founded Jamestown in Virginia in 1607. The Pilgrims arrived aboard the Mayflower in 1620 and established Plymouth Colony. Over the following decades, thousands of settlers from England, Scotland, Wales, Ireland, Germany, the Netherlands, France, and other parts of Europe crossed the Atlantic seeking land, opportunity, or religious freedom. Each family carried more than just belongings. They carried their names. Those names would become the foundation of American genealogy. Why were last names important? Today, a surname is simply part of our identity, but in the 1600s and 1700s, a surname meant much more. A family name identified your ancestry, occupation, social standing, and sometimes even where your family originally lived. Colonial governments depended on surnames for nearly everything. Taxes, military service, land ownership, church membership, marriage records, paternity inheritance. Without consistent surnames, maintaining legal records would have been almost impossible. That's why colonial officials carefully recorded family names in church books, tax rolls, censuses, wills, and land deeds. Many of these records still survive today. The origins of English surnames. Most settlers arriving in colonial America already had hereditary surnames. England had largely adopted permanent family names by the 1500s. These surnames usually came from four major sources. The first were occupational names. Someone who worked as a blacksmith became Smith, a baker became Baker, a tailor became Taylor. A mill worker became Miller, a carpenter became Carpenter. These names often remained with the family long after later generations changed professions. The second type came from parents. A man named John might have a son known as Johnson, literally meaning John's son. Likewise, Williamson, Richardson, and Harrison followed the same pattern. The third group described locations. Families living near hills, woods, rivers, or bridges often adopted names reflecting those places. Examples include hill, wood, brooks, fields, marsh, and rivers. Finally, some surnames described physical characteristics or personality: brown, white, short, long, strong, young. Little these descriptive names eventually became permanent family surnames. Crossing the Atlantic leaving England for America was never easy. The Atlantic crossing often lasted between 6 and 12 weeks. Passengers endured storms, disease, limited food, and overcrowded ships. Many never reached America alive. Those who survived arrived with hope. Families settled along rivers because transportation depended heavily on waterways. They cleared forests, built wooden homes, established farms, and created communities that slowly expanded across the colonies. Each settlement became home to familiar surnames repeated generation after generation. Virginia. The first English colony, Virginia, quickly became England's most successful colony. Tobacco farming created enormous demand for workers. As immigration increased, surnames like Smith, Carter, Walker, Harris, Brown, Johnson, Clark, Martin, White, and Lewis became increasingly common throughout the colony. Large plantations required detailed legal records. Land ownership passed through generations, making surnames essential for inheritance. Many Virginia families appearing in records during the early 1700s still have descendants living in America today. New England further north, Massachusetts developed differently. The Puritans emphasized education and record keeping. Churches carefully documented baptisms, marriages, and deaths. Because literacy rates were unusually high, New England produced some of America's best preserved colonial records. These documents reveal countless familiar surnames: Adams, Allen Bradford, Clark Cooper, Foster, Hall King Mason Parker, Warren Wood. Each represented real families helping build colonial society. Dutch influence. Not every surname in colonial America came from England. The Dutch established New Netherland during the early 1600s. Their capital eventually became New York City. Dutch families introduced surnames like Van Dyke, Van Buren, Van Cortlandt, and Van der Veer. The prefix van simply meant from. Even after England captured New Netherland in 1664, many Dutch families remained. Their surnames became permanent parts of American history. German immigration. During the early 1700s, thousands of German-speaking immigrants settled primarily in Pennsylvania. Many fled religious persecution and economic hardship. German surnames included Muller, Schneider, Wagner, Becker, Fischer, Bauer, Schmidt, and Zimmermann. Over time, many names changed spelling. Muller often became Miller, Schmidt frequently became Smith, Zimmermann sometimes became Carpenter. These changes reflected English pronunciation and simplified official records. Scottish and Irish families. Large numbers of Scottish and Scotch-Irish immigrants arrived throughout the 18th century. Many settled along America's frontier. Names like Campbell, Stewart, Graham, McDonald, Mackenzie, Wilson, Kennedy, and Thompson spread rapidly across the colonies. These settlers often became farmers, traders, soldiers, and pioneers moving westward into unexplored territories. French Huguenots, French Protestants known as Huguenots, fled persecution in France. Many established communities in South Carolina, Virginia, and New York. Surnames such as Dubois, Fontaine, Lefebvre, Durant, and Laurens became part of colonial America's growing cultural diversity. Though many families gradually adopted English customs, they proudly preserved their French ancestry. Native Americans and African communities' colonial surnames were not limited to European settlers. Native American communities maintained their own naming traditions, although colonial governments often replaced indigenous names with English versions in official records. Similarly, enslaved Africans brought to America came from many different cultures with rich naming traditions. Enslavement frequently erased original family identities. Many enslaved people were assigned English surnames connected to plantation owners or local customs. After emancipation generations later, countless African American families chose new surnames representing freedom, faith, or family heritage. Their story forms an important part of American surname history. Why old records matter today? Historians study thousands of surviving colonial documents, church registers, tax records, land deeds, marriage licenses, military rosters, probate files, and early census records. Each document helps reconstruct families that lived centuries ago. Sometimes a single handwritten signature reveals when a family first arrived. Sometimes one faded surname connects millions of modern descendants to an ancestor who crossed the Atlantic over 300 years ago. These fragile pages preserve more than names. They preserve lives. The birth of American identity. By the middle of the 18th century, the colonies contained millions of people. Children born in America no longer considered England their true home. Although their surnames reflected European origins, their identity had become uniquely American. The same names repeated across towns, counties, and colonies: Smith Brown, Johnson Williams, Clark Harris, Taylor Cooper, Allen Martin. These ordinary surnames quietly became the foundation of American society. No one could imagine that within a few decades, these same families would witness one of history's greatest revolutions. The American Revolution would transform colonies into a nation. But before independence arrived, one remarkable government project would capture a snapshot of these families, a detailed record that preserved thousands of surnames for future generations. That record would become one of the most valuable tools for historians and genealogists alike. As the American colonies grew larger during the 18th century, one challenge became increasingly difficult for colonial governments. How do you keep track of thousands of families spread across hundreds of towns, farms, and settlements? Who owned which land? Who paid taxes? Who could vote? Who served in the local militia? And perhaps most importantly, who belonged to which family? To answer these questions, colonial officials began creating detailed records that carefully documented the names of their people. These records would become some of the most valuable historical documents ever created. Today, they allow historians and genealogists to trace family lines back more than 300 years. A colony built on paper life in colonial America depended on written records. Whenever a child was born, local churches often recorded the baptism. When two people married, ministers entered their names into parish books. If someone purchased land, the county clerk prepared a deed. When a family member died, a probate court recorded the inheritance. Every important event left behind paperwork. Most colonists never imagined these ordinary records would one day become priceless historical treasures. But they did. The importance of church records before governments became responsible for recording births and deaths. Churches handled much of that responsibility. Almost every colonial community had a local church. Whether Anglican, Puritan, Lutheran, Presbyterian, Dutch Reformed, or Quaker, each congregation maintained books containing family information. Inside those books were names that remain familiar today: Smith, Brown, Clark, Adams, Walker, Martin, Cooper, Allen, Harris, Taylor, Williams. Johnson's generation after generation appeared in the same church records. Children grew into adults, adults married. Families expanded. Entire communities could be reconstructed from these carefully written pages. Land meant everything in colonial America. Land represented wealth. Owning farmland meant security. Owning hundreds of acres meant influence. Every transfer of property required official documentation. Because of this, county courthouses accumulated thousands of land deeds. These documents reveal not only who owned property, but also where families lived, who their neighbors were, and how communities expanded over time. Sometimes a surname appears in the same county records for nearly 2 centuries. Entire generations remained on the same farms. Reading an old deed, imagine opening a faded document written in elegant 18th century handwriting. The paper is yellowed with age, the ink has faded, but the words remain surprisingly clear. I, Thomas Carter of York County, Virginia. Immediately, historians learned several things: the man's full surname, his county, his approximate social status, the date. Often, the document also lists his wife, children, neighbors, and witnesses. One single page can identify an entire community. Tax list taxes have never been popular, but for historians, colonial tax records are priceless. Every taxpayer's surname appears year after year. If someone disappears from the tax rolls, historians know they either moved, died, or sold their property. If a young man suddenly appears for the first time, it often means he reached adulthood and became responsible for paying taxes. These patterns allow researchers to reconstruct family histories even when other records have been lost. Military rosters colonial America constantly faced conflict. Local militias protected settlements from attacks and later prepared for war against Britain. Military rolls listed thousands of surnames. Farmers, blacksmiths, carpenters, merchants, teachers, ministers. Ordinary men became soldiers. Many famous American surnames first appeared together on militia records years before the Revolutionary War. These lists remind us that America's independence was fought not only by famous leaders, but by countless ordinary families. Wills and probate records. Perhaps no document reveals more about a colonial family than a will. When someone died, they carefully listed every possession: land, livestock, furniture, tools, silverware, books, clothing, even kitchen utensils. More importantly, they listed the people who would inherit them: my son John, my daughter Mary, my beloved wife Elizabeth, my grandson Samuel. Suddenly, one document connects multiple generations. Genealogists treasure these records because they prove family relationships beyond doubt. The rise of county courthouses as settlements expanded. Every county established its own courthouse. Inside were shelves filled with handwritten books, marriage licenses, court cases, road construction, business agreements, estate inventories, debt collections. Election records. Nearly every adult colonist appeared somewhere within these pages. For modern researchers, county courthouses remain among the richest sources of early American family history. Literacy changes. One reason colonial America produced such excellent records was literacy. Compared with many parts of Europe, literacy rates in New England were remarkably high. Parents wanted children to read the Bible. Schools became common. More people learned to write. As a result, signatures became increasingly common, rather than marking documents with an X. Many colonists proudly signed their own names. Today, those signatures provide direct connections to individuals who lived centuries ago. The Revolution approaches by the 1760s and early 1770s. Tensions between Britain and its American colonies had reached dangerous levels. Taxes increased, political arguments intensified, boycotts spread, communities divided, yet everyday life continued. Families still farmed, children still attended church, land was still bought and sold. Officials continued recording surnames exactly as they had for decades. No one realized history was about to change forever. Preserving family identity. One remarkable feature of colonial records is how often entire families remained together. Unlike today's highly mobile society, many families rarely moved far from home. Grandparents, parents, children, cousins, uncles, and neighbors often lived within a few miles of one another. The same surnames repeated across every record. If you walked through a Virginia village in 1770, you might meet several Carter families, several Harris families, multiple Smiths, multiple Browns. Entire communities shared common surnames because generations stayed close together. Why spellings changed. One challenge for modern genealogists is spelling. Colonial spelling was far from standardized. A clerk simply wrote what he heard. The surname Clark might appear as Clark. Johnson might become Johnston. Smith occasionally appeared as Smith. Taylor sometimes became Taylor. Even members of the same family occasionally spelled their own surnames differently. This wasn't considered unusual. Standard spelling simply wasn't as important as it is today. Researchers must often search several variations of the same surname before finding the correct ancestor. Women in colonial records. Women appear throughout colonial records, although often less frequently than men. Marriage records preserve maiden names. Probate files identify daughters and widows. Church registers document baptisms and family relationships. Without these records, countless family histories would remain incomplete. Women's surnames often connected powerful colonial families through marriage, creating networks that influenced politics, business, and local society. Family names become American. By the eve of the American Revolution, many surnames had already spent generations in North America. Although originally English, Dutch, German, Scottish, Irish, or French, These families increasingly viewed themselves as Americans. Children born in Boston, Philadelphia, Charleston, Williamsburg, and New York had never seen Europe. Their surname reflected ancestral origins. But their identity belonged to the colonies. They farmed American soil, they built American towns, and soon they would fight for American independence. The families behind history. When people think about colonial America, famous names usually come to mind: Washington, Jefferson, Franklin, Adams. But these famous individuals represented only a tiny fraction of colonial society. Most Americans carried ordinary surnames: Smith, Brown, Walker, Miller, Cooper, White, Clark, King, Lewis, Hall, Allen, Martin. These ordinary families planted crops, built homes, opened shops, raised children, served in local militias, maintained churches, and quietly built the foundations of an entirely new nation. History often remembers presidents and generals, but America was truly built by thousands of ordinary families whose names still appear in telephone books, school records, and neighborhoods today. A snapshot before independence, just before the Revolution, changed everything. Colonial records captured one final snapshot of everyday life. Those pages preserve the names of families living ordinary lives before extraordinary events unfolded. Within only a few years, many of those same surnames would appear in military records, pension files, casualty lists, and Revolutionary War documents. Some families would remain loyal to Britain, others would fight for independence, neighbors would become enemies, brothers would serve on opposite sides. The familiar surnames found in peaceful church registers would soon be connected to one of history's greatest struggles for freedom, and that is exactly where our story goes next. The year is 1775. Across the 13 American colonies, something extraordinary is about to happen. For decades, ordinary families had lived peaceful lives. They farmed their land, attended church every Sunday, traded goods with neighbors, and raised children who expected to inherit the same homes their parents had built. But everything was changing. Political disagreements with Britain had turned into open conflict. The sound of church bells was replaced by the sound of muskets. Village meetings became military gatherings. Blacksmiths forged weapons instead of farming tools. And thousands of ordinary men whose surnames filled colonial church books and land records suddenly found themselves preparing for war. The story of colonial America's surnames is no longer just about genealogy. It is now the story of a nation being born. Ordinary families, extraordinary times. One of the greatest misconceptions about the American Revolution is that it was fought only by famous figures like George Washington or Benjamin Franklin. In reality, the Revolution depended on thousands of ordinary families: the Smiths, the Browns, the Clarks, the Taylors, the Martins, the Walkers, the Harrises, the Millers, the Coopers. These were farmers, shopkeepers, teachers, carpenters, and blacksmiths, most never expected to become part of history, yet their names appear repeatedly in militia rolls, supply records, tax lists, and pension documents. Without them, independence would never have been achieved. The Smith family surname appears more frequently in colonial records than Smith. The name originally referred to a blacksmith, a craftsman who worked with iron. In colonial America, blacksmiths were among the most important people in every community. They made horseshoes, farm tools, nails, axes, locks, cooking equipment. During the Revolution, they repaired muskets and forged bayonets. Without blacksmiths, armies simply could not function, because every town needed one. The surname Smith spread rapidly throughout the colonies. By the late 18th century, Smith had become one of America's most common family names, a position it still holds today. The Brown family, the surname Brown, originally described someone with brown hair, dark clothing, or a darker complexion. Still, as it sounds, the name became incredibly widespread across England before crossing the Atlantic. Colonial Browns became merchants, farmers, soldiers, ministers, and shipbuilders. Records from nearly every colony contain Brown families. Some remained loyal to Britain, others fought for independence. The surname appears on both sides of the Revolutionary War, reminding us how divided colonial society had become. The Johnson family, Johnson, literally means the son of John. John had been one of the most popular names in England for centuries. Naturally, Johnson became one of the most common surnames. By the 1700s, Johnson families could be found from New Hampshire to Georgia. Some operated farms, others became lawyers. Some served as colonial officials. Many joined local militias. Because so many unrelated Johnson families lived in America, historians often rely on land records and church books to distinguish one family from another. The Williams family, like Johnson, Williams developed from a father's given name. It originally meant descendant of William. William had been an extremely popular name ever since William the Conqueror invaded England in 1066. By colonial times, countless unrelated Williams families had settled throughout America. Some became successful merchants in port cities, others cleared forests on the frontier. Many descendants would later move westward after independence, carrying the surname across the expanding nation. The Adams family, unlike Smith or Brown, the surname Adams became closely associated with American history. One famous colonial family produced remarkable political leaders. Their influence helped shape the movement toward independence, yet thousands of unrelated Adams families also lived throughout the colonies. The surname itself simply means son of Adam. Long before becoming connected with famous statesmen, Adams had already been a respected English family name. Its presence in colonial records demonstrates how ordinary surnames sometimes become linked to extraordinary individuals. German names become American. Not every family carried English surnames. Pennsylvania, in particular, welcomed thousands of German-speaking immigrants. Names such as Schmidt, Miller, Schneider, Wagner, Becker, Bauer, and Fischer appeared in church records written entirely in German. Over time, many names changed. Schmidt often became Smith, Muller became Miller, Schneider became Snyder, Zimmerman became Zimmerman. Some families changed their spelling voluntarily. Others simply accepted whatever local officials wrote. These gradual changes remind us that surnames evolve over time. Scottish and Irish heritage. Large numbers of Scottish and Scotch-Irish families settled along America's western frontier. Life there was dangerous. Native conflicts, harsh winters, and isolation tested every community. Families named Campbell, Graham, Stewart, Wilson, Kennedy, MacDonald, and Thompson became known for resilience and independence. Many frontier settlers possessed military experience gained before arriving in America. When revolution came, these communities supplied experienced fighters familiar with difficult conditions. Dutch families in New York. Although England controlled New York after 1664, Dutch influence remained strong. Families named Van Buren, Van Dyke, Van Rensselaer, and Van Cortlandt continued owning farms. Businesses and trading companies. Many still spoke Dutch at home. Their churches maintained Dutch traditions for generations. These families demonstrate that colonial America was far more diverse than many people imagine. English culture dominated politically, but Dutch customs remained deeply rooted throughout New York. Family businesses. Many colonial surnames became associated with particular occupations. The bakers baked bread, the millers operated grain mills, the coopers crafted wooden barrels. The carpenters built homes, the tailors made clothing, the fishers sunned, the fishers caught fish, the potters produced pottery. Although descendants often entered completely different professions, the original occupational surname remained. Centuries later, someone named Baker may never have baked bread, yet the surname still preserves a forgotten family history. Communities built on trust colonial towns depended heavily on reputation. Everyone knew everyone. A family surname represented trust. If a merchant cheated customers, his surname suffered. If a craftsman produced excellent work, future generations benefited from that reputation. Business partnerships often depended entirely upon family names. Good reputations became valuable forms of inheritance. Parents carefully protected the family surname because it influenced opportunities for their children. The Revolutionary War changes. Everything as fighting spread across the colonies. Family names began appearing in entirely new records: military enlistments, officer commissions, prisoner exchanges, battle reports, casualty lists, pension applications. Suddenly, surnames once found only in peaceful church books now documented sacrifice and courage. Entire families served together, fathers and sons, brothers, uncles and nephews. Some never returned home. Loyalists and patriots. Not every colonial family supported independence. Historians estimate that perhaps 1/3 of colonists favored the patriot cause. Another third remained loyal to Britain. The remaining population tried to stay neutral. This meant identical surnames often appeared on opposite sides. One Johnson family might fight for independence. Another Johnson family might remain loyal to the British Crown. After the war, many Loyalist families left America entirely, relocating to Canada, England, or the Caribbean. Their surnames continued, but in different countries. The cost of war. The Revolutionary War lasted 8 long years. Farms were destroyed, homes burned, businesses collapsed. Many colonial records disappeared forever during battles and fires. Courthouses were damaged, churches were destroyed, important family documents vanished. This is one reason why surviving colonial records are so valuable today. Each surviving page represents history that narrowly escaped destruction. A new nation is born in 1783. The Revolutionary War officially ended. The United States had become an independent nation. Millions of people now belonged to a completely new country. Yet despite this enormous political change, family names remained remarkably consistent. The same surnames recorded before the Revolution continued appearing afterward. Children inherited them, grandchildren inherited them. Generation after generation carried those names into America's future. Westward expansion independence created new opportunities. Families began moving beyond the original 13 states. They traveled into Kentucky, Ohio, Tennessee, Indiana, Illinois, Missouri. Every wagon carried more than furniture and supplies. It carried a family surname. As settlers established new towns, familiar colonial names appeared once again: Smith, Brown, Walker, Johnson, Clark, Taylor, Martin, Cooper, Harris, Williams. The map changed, the surnames remained. The legacy of colonial families today. Millions of Americans unknowingly share surnames with families recorded in colonial documents more than 250 years ago. Some are direct descendants. Others simply inherited the same ancient surname through completely different family lines. Either way, these names connect modern America with its earliest history. Every old census page, every faded church register, every handwritten land deed, and every military roster tells the same remarkable story. Behind every surname stood a real family. People who dreamed, worked, struggled, loved, and helped create the nation we know today. But one final question remains. What happened to these original colonial surnames after America continued growing through the 19th and 20th centuries? Which names survived? Which disappeared? And why do some colonial family names remain among the most common surnames in America today? More than 2 centuries have passed since the birth of the United States. The wooden colonial villages have become modern cities. Horse-drawn wagons have been replaced by highways and airplanes. The handwritten records kept by colonial clerks are now preserved in climate-controlled archives and digitized for people around the world. But one thing has remained remarkably unchanged: the surnames. Millions of Americans still carry family names that first appeared in colonial America more than 250 years ago. Every time someone introduces themselves as Smith, Johnson, Williams, Brown, Miller, Taylor, Clark, Harris, Cooper, Walker, or Martin, they are carrying a small piece of history, a history that began long before the United States existed. The first national census after winning independence, the new federal government faced an important question: how many people actually lived in the United States? To not answer that question, Congress ordered the country's first official census in 1790. Government officials traveled from town to town, recording the names of heads of households. These census books became one of the most valuable historical records ever created. For many families, this is the first time their surname appears in the records of the United States as an independent nation. The census counted nearly 4 million people living across the young republic. Among those millions were thousands of familiar colonial surnames that had already existed for generations: Smith, Brown, Johnson, Williams, Clark, Tyler, Miller, Adams, Walker, Hall, Lewis, Cooper. These names had survived the Revolution. Now they would become part of American history forever. Moving west, the new nation grew quickly. Land beyond the Appalachian Mountains attracted thousands of families seeking opportunity. Entire communities packed their belongings into wagons and headed west. The journey was dangerous. Roads were rough. Rivers were difficult to cross. Disease and harsh weather threatened every traveler, but hope pushed them forward. As they settled new territories, they carried more than furniture and livestock. They carried their surnames. Soon, the same family names that once appeared in Virginia and Massachusetts began appearing in Kentucky, Ohio, Tennessee, Indiana, Illinois, and Missouri. America expanded. The surnames expanded with it. Immigration changes America. During the 19th century, millions of new immigrants arrived from Europe. The United States became one of the world's great destinations for people seeking freedom and opportunity. Irish immigrants arrived after the Great Famine. German immigration increased dramatically. Later came Italians, Poles, Scandinavians, Jews from Eastern Europe, and many others. Each group brought its own family names. Some kept their original spelling. Others changed them to fit English pronunciation. Names that had once seemed foreign gradually became part of everyday American life. The nation's collection of surnames became richer and more diverse with every generation. Why? Some names changed. Many immigrants decided to simplify their surnames. Long or difficult spellings were shortened. Letters disappeared. Pronunciations changed. Sometimes these changes happened voluntarily. Sometimes government officials or local clerks simply wrote the names as they heard them. For example, the German surname Müller often became Miller. Schmidt sometimes became Smith. Dutch and Scandinavian names also evolved over time. These changes make genealogy both fascinating and challenging. Researchers often discover that a single family used several different spellings over the course of one century. The rise of genealogy for many years. Old family records remained hidden in attics, churches, libraries, and county courthouses. Few people paid much attention to them, but during the 20th century, interest in family history exploded. People wanted to know where they came from. Who were their ancestors? When did their family arrive in America? What did they do? Genealogists began studying birth records, marriage licenses, military documents, passenger lists, wills, and census records. Old surnames suddenly became keys that unlocked forgotten stories. Every document connected another generation. Every discovery brought families closer to their past. Technology brings history to life today. Researching family history is easier than ever before. Millions of historical documents have been scanned and preserved digitally. A surname written by a colonial clerk in the 18th century can now be viewed on a computer or smartphone anywhere in the world. Researchers compare census records, immigration lists, military files, and church registers within minutes. What once required years of travel and research can often begin with a single search. Technology has made America's oldest surnames more accessible than ever before. DNA and family history. Modern DNA testing has added an entirely new dimension to genealogy. People can now compare their genetic information with millions of others. Many discover relatives they never knew existed. Some confirm stories that had been passed down through generations. Others uncover surprising origins that completely change what they believed about their family. While DNA cannot replace historical records, it often supports and expands them. Together, documents and genetics create a more complete picture of the American story. More than just a name. A surname is much more than a collection of letters. It represents generations of people. Every family experienced moments of joy and hardship. They celebrated births. They mourned losses. They survived wars, epidemics, economic struggles, and natural disasters. Some became wealthy, others remained poor. Some achieved fame, most lived ordinary lives. Yet every one of them contributed to the growth of the nation. When we study surnames, we are really studying people. And people are what make history meaningful. The names that never disappeared, some colonial surnames, remain among the most common names in the United States today. Smith, Johnson, Williams, Brown, Jones, Miller, Davis, Wilson, Taylor, Clark. These names appear in every state. They belong to people from every background, profession, and community. Although many families sharing these surnames are not related, they all carry names that have deep historical roots. These names have survived revolutions, migrations, industrialization, civil wars, world wars, and the rapid changes of the modern world. Very few traditions have lasted as long. Every family has a story. Perhaps your own surname appears in colonial records. Perhaps your ancestors arrived later. Maybe your family came from Europe in the 19th century. Maybe they came from Asia, Africa, Latin America, or another part of the world. Every family has its own journey. Every surname tells a unique story. Some stories are well documented. Others remain mysteries waiting to be discovered. History is not only about famous leaders. It is about ordinary people whose lives shaped the future. Preserving the past across America, historians and archivists continue protecting fragile colonial records. Old paper naturally deteriorates. Ink fades. Books become damaged. Without careful preservation, priceless information could disappear forever. Libraries, museums, historical societies, and archives work every day to protect these documents for future generations. Because of their efforts, names written hundreds of years ago will continue to survive for centuries to come. A connection across time. Imagine holding a copy of a land deed signed in 1725. Or reading a church register that records the baptism of a child whose descendants are alive today. Those names connect the past and the present. The people who signed those documents could never have imagined airplanes, computers, or the internet, yet their surnames continue to be spoken every day. History is not as distant as it seems. Sometimes it lives in something as simple as the name written on a driver's license, a school diploma, or a family mailbox. Final thoughts. The story of colonial America's original last names is not simply a list of old family names. It is the story of courage, of migration, of faith, of hard work, of survival. These families crossed oceans in fragile wooden ships. They cleared forests, built homes, cried towns, established farms, owned businesses, defended their communities, fought for independence, raised children, and helped create one of the world's newest nations. Their names became woven into the fabric of American history. Some names changed, some disappeared, many survived. Today, whenever we encounter one of these historic surnames, we are reminded that behind every name was a real person with dreams, fears, and hopes for the future. The story of America's original last names is ultimately the story of America itself, and perhaps, somewhere within those centuries-old records, one of those names is yours. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this journey through the history of colonial America's original last names, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you won't miss our next exploration into the fascinating stories hidden inside history. Until next time, thanks for watching.